Today we're going to talk about lower cross syndrome, what lower cross syndrome is and what causes it, why it's so important for us to address, and most importantly, how to fix it. Lower cross syndrome is a postural distortion characterized by an anterior pelvic tilt and lordosis. What that means is that during either static or dynamic postures, meaning either standing still or during motion, the core, you no longer see a stacking of the pelvis and the rib cage, but you see a shearing of the lower back and the pelvis and the rib cage. So if you can imagine your pelvis, your big hip bone, as if it was a bucket full of water, what you can do with that bucket is you can dump water out the front, you can dump water out the back, or you can hold that pelvis neutral where you have no water dumping out either end. An anterior pelvic tilt, anterior meaning the front of your body, is when that pelvis tilts forward, therefore dumping water out the front. What this does when the pelvis is in this posture is it affects the kinetic chain both below and above it. That kinetic chain above the pelvis happens to be the lumbar spine, and when that pelvis dumps forward, you tend to see an over-exaggerated curvature of that lumbar spine, which is called lordosis. So what actually causes lower cross syndrome, anterior pelvic tilt, lordosis? There's a couple of things that contribute to this chronic static posture. First of all, behaviors such as sedentary behavior is a major contributor to lower cross syndrome. Many of us, myself included, I'm a kinesiology student and a personal trainer. I spend lots of my day sitting down being sedentary. When we spend a lot of time in that seated position, it tends to put us into that lower cross syndrome posture with our pelvis tilted forward and our back overextended. Another thing that can lead to lower cross syndrome is chronically tight or overactive or hypertonic muscles, namely the iliopsoas muscle, specifically the psoas major muscle, and the lower back, or the rectus spinae. The psoas major muscle connects onto the femur and onto the lumbar spine. The psoas major, what its major role is to pull your hip into flexion. Okay, and what muscles do is they pull on bones, but they don't just pull in one direction. That muscle can also pull, instead of your hip to your lumbar spine, it can also pull your lumbar spine to your hip. Okay, so it pulls in both directions. That's one issue that can cause that anterior pelvic tilt. The other issue is our rectus spinae. Our rectus spinae is a group of muscles that run all the way from the hip all the way up into your cervical spine. We're specifically talking about the lumbar portion of the rectus spinae muscle group. What these can do is contract and they extend that low back. And what they can do is if that low back extends, it tends to pull that hip posture into that hyperextended position. Now, on the other hand, weak muscles can also contribute to lower cross syndrome. The rectus abdominis, the muscle that most of us think about when we think about the core, our six-pack muscle, connects onto the lower rib cage and onto our pubic symphysis, right onto the bottom of our pelvis. What its job is to flex the spine. And during normal static posture, hopefully that rectus abdominis is strong enough that it can pull the pelvis into a neutral position, or even the converse, which is a posterior pelvic tilt. But if this muscle tends to be weak, and again these other muscles tend to be tight, what this muscle being weak does is it's unable to pull that pelvis into a neutral position, again, further contributing to this anterior pelvic tilt. The last muscle that's really important to talk about, a muscle that tends to be weak if we have an anterior pelvic tilt, is the glute muscle, specifically the gluteus maximus, the biggest muscle in the glute family. The gluteus maximus connects onto the top of the pelvic muscle and down onto our hip bone. Okay, and if this muscle, again, if you can imagine, its major function is to hip extend, it's to kick our leg back. But again, it also functions the other way around, which is to pull that pelvis down towards our hip. So we can either pull our hip towards our pelvis or our pelvis towards our hip. And again, if this muscle tends to be weak, it's not strong enough to be able to resist these chronically tight muscles that are pulling us into the anterior pelvic tilt. And so when we put these four muscles together, a weak abdomen, a weak glute, a tight iliopsoas, specifically psoas major, and a tight low back, this is where that cross comes from in the lower cross syndrome. We have weak and weak, creating a cross. We have tight and tight, creating a cross. All resulting in an anterior pelvic tilt. So this brings me to the last portion of this video. What can we actually do in order to fix lower cross syndrome and hopefully alleviate some lower back pain or risk of developing lower back pain or potential injuries that we can be at risk of developing with a lower cross syndrome posture? The answer, unsurprisingly, is exercise. I have 4 drills that we can put into practice that's going to address the abdomen, the glutes, the iliopsoas, and the low back rectus spinae muscle group in order to help alleviate lower cross syndrome. These 4 exercises are simple, easy to do, and very effective for treating lower cross syndrome. And the best part is that you can do this with no equipment. You can do this in your home when you wake up, throughout the day, during a quick break if you're at work. Very, very easy to do. The first stretch that we're going to do is to address the iliopsoas muscle group, the hip flexor muscle group. What I want you to do is called a runner stretch. You're going to come into a tall kneeling posture. From here, when you're standing up tall, what I already want you to do is imagine that pelvic being a bucket, and I want you to try to dump water out the back. So I'm tilting my pelvis back. I already feel a stretch in my iliopsoas and my hip flexors when I assume that posture. And then from there, while maintaining that pelvic tilt, that posterior pelvic tilt, you're going to translate your hips forward to exacerbate that stretch. We're going to hold this stretch on both sides for 90 seconds total, broken up into 3 chunks. So that'll be 3 times 30 seconds. The second stretch that we're going to do is for the low back. This one is going to be a self-hug. You're going to lay down on the ground, bring your knees up into the chest, and I want you to pull your knees as high up into your chest as you possibly can. And I want you to actually get a rounding of the low back. I want you to relax, let your hips sink down, stretch out that low back. Again, just like the runner stretch, we're going to hold this for 90 seconds total, broken up into 3 chunks, 3 times 30 seconds. Those are our 2 stretches that we want to do to address lower cross syndrome. Now we're going to do 2 strength exercises. We're going to do a dead bug and a glute bridge raise. The dead bug is an exercise that many of us are probably familiar with. Sometimes we can think that this exercise is really quite easy, and I can guarantee you if it's easy, you're probably doing it wrong. In order to properly do a dead bug, what we need to do is lay down flat on the ground, hands and legs up, maintain a neutral position with the core. From here, we must stabilize that core while we reach back with the opposite arm and opposite leg, and then back up to that starting posture without moving our spine. Now what we need to do, very important for this posture, is to find that neutral pelvic tilt. So what we can do to find that is if you assume this posture, I want you to take one hand and reach underneath your back. Okay, right now I can maybe get the tips of my fingers underneath my back. That's perfect, that's what I want you guys to have. If we're in this posture and we're up and doing our dead bug and you reach underneath and suddenly you can get your whole hand underneath, this is when we're in that posterior pelvic tilt position. We have no core integrity happening right now, and we're actually just working our hip flexor muscles. So what we need to do is round that pelvis in to that low back. Again, you can just barely get your fingertips underneath your low back. Once we've found this posture, we must hold that posture while we reach out. So as you reach out, again, I can only still get my fingertips. Nothing about my core has changed. If you reach out and you find you reach out and suddenly, once again, you can get your whole hand underneath your low back, you're doing it wrong. You must maintain that core stability. We're going to do this exercise for 20 repetitions for 2 sets. The last exercise we're going to do is for the glutes. We're going to do a hip bridge. This is going to be in a very similar starting position to that dead bug. Again, I want you to find that neutral pelvic tilt with our knees bent to 90 degrees. Once we have that neutral pelvic tilt, I want your toes up so that your heels are on the floor, hands out to the side for stability, and you're going to push your heels down into the ground and thrust your hips up nice and tall. I want you to feel that in your glutes. That's where the heels and that neutral pelvic tilt come into place. So you're pushing down into the earth with your heels. You're not trying to lift your hips up nice and tall. Again, if you're doing this exercise wrong, you might start to feel it in your low back. And that probably means that as you go to press up, you're losing that neutral pelvic tilt, and you're pushing yourself into a posterior pelvic tilt, and you're accentuating that lower back tilt, and you're just using your back. Again, that is not what we want to do. We want to find that neutral tilt and use your legs, use your heels, use your bum to push down into the floor. Again, just like the dead bug, we're going to do this exercise for 20 reps for 2 sets. Thanks for watching. Hopefully after all that you understand what lower cross syndrome is, why it's so important to be talking about lower cross syndrome, and most importantly, how to fix it. This video, again, just like my other videos in this series, are part of, it's a passion of mine to spread hopefully reputable and knowledgeable information about the human body, about exercise, and about fitness, and most importantly, longevity. I'm a personal trainer and I am a student. I study kinesiology. This is my passion, and education is part of my passion, so I'm hoping to be able to give more insights about the human body, and again, practical advice on how to increase your quality of life and your functional strength. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next one.